He had 30 seconds to decide who would die. Lieutenant Charlie Brown gripped the yoke of his B-17 bomber as smoke filled the cockpit. December 20th, 1943. The skies over Germany had turned his flying fortress into a dying bird. Half his crew was wounded. The tail gunner was gone. And below him, through the shattered glass, he could see the German town of Bremen spreading like a map of innocent lives. The controls were barely responding. Every instinct screamed to bail out. Save yourself. Save your crew. Let gravity take the plane wherever physics demanded. But physics demanded it would crash into the heart of the town, into homes where families were gathering for dinner, into streets where children played despite the war. Charlie's hands trembled on the controls, not from fear, from the weight of choice. 20 seconds now. His co-pilot was unconscious, blood streaming from a head wound. The navigator's charts were soaked red. They'd been hit by flak over the target, then jumped by fighters on the way back. The plane was dying, and it wanted to take a piece of Germany with it, a town. Hundreds of people who'd done nothing but live in the wrong place at the wrong time. 10 seconds. Charlie Brown made his choice. He would not let his death become their death. He would not let this machine turn into a weapon against the innocent. With every ounce of strength left in his battered body, he pulled the yoke hard to the right. The plane groaned. Metal screamed. But it turned. Away from Bremen. Away from the houses and the churches and the schools. Toward the empty fields beyond. The ground rushed up to meet them like an old enemy. But Charlie Brown had already won his battle. War makes philosophers of farm boys and killers of kind men. Charlie Brown was both and neither. Growing up in West Virginia, he'd watched his father work the coal mines, coming home each night with hands black as the conscience of war. His mother would wash those hands at the kitchen sink, and young Charlie would watch the dark water swirl down the drain, never knowing he'd one day wash blood from his own hands in the skies over Europe. He wasn't supposed to be a pilot. At 5'7", he was too short by military standards, but standards change when you're losing a war. When experienced pilots are dying faster than you can train new ones. When boys who should be in college are instead learning to drop death from 25,000 feet. The recruiting officer had looked at Charlie's determination, not his height. Had seen the steel in his spine that no measuring tape could capture. Flight school in Texas. The heat was nothing compared to the burning in his chest. The need to fly, to fight, to matter. He excelled at everything they threw at him. Navigation, gunnery, formation flying, but it was in the quiet moments, lying on his cot at night, that he'd think about what it meant to drop bombs on cities, on people. The instructors never talked about that. They talked about targets and objectives, about tonnage and accuracy, never about the families beneath the bombs. His first mission was supposed to be easy. A milk run, they called it. Hit the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire and come home for dinner. But there's no such thing as easy when you're flying a 10-ton bomber through skies owned by the Luftwaffe. The flak was so thick you could walk on it, they said. Charlie learned it was true, black puffs of death blooming around them like poisonous flowers. The plane next to them simply disappeared. One moment it was there, 10 men inside. The next, just smoke and falling metal. That night, Charlie couldn't eat. He kept thinking about those 10 men, about their families back home who didn't know yet, who were maybe sitting down to dinner, talking about the weather, about work, about anything but the telegram that was already on its way. He learned then that every mission was a roll of dice with death, and death always held the loaded dice. But he kept flying, mission after mission, because if he didn't, someone else would have to. Someone else's son or brother or father. The logic of war is simple and terrible. If you don't do it, someone else must. So Charlie Brown climbed into his bomber again and again, each time carrying a little less of the boy from West Virginia and a little more of the warrior the world had made him become. December 20th, 1943, started like any other mission. Cold, dark, afraid. 4 a.m. The briefing room smelled of cigarettes and fear sweat. Colonel Harrison pulled back the curtain on the map and everyone groaned. Bremen, again. The aircraft factories there were priority targets. But Bremen was a fortress, anti-aircraft guns by the hundreds, fighter bases all around. They'd lost 12 planes there last month, 120 men. Charlie did the math in his head. 1 in 4 chance of not coming back? Ye old pub sat on the hard stand like a patient horse. Charlie's B-17, named after a tavern back home where his crew used to drink before shipping out. She was ugly and beautiful at once. Olive drab paint peeling, patches over patches where flak had kissed her. 4 engines that sang a symphony of controlled explosions. 10 .50 caliber machine guns that made her a flying porcupine. And a bomb bay that could carry 8,000 pounds of destruction. The crew was already doing pre-flight checks. These men were Charlie's family now. Closer than family. You don't choose family, but you choose who you fly with. And these 9 men had chosen each other. There was Andy, the co-pilot from Boston, always talking about his girl back home. Frenchie, the bombardier who could put a bomb in a pickle barrel from 5 miles up. Doc, the navigator, who never got lost even when the stars were hidden by smoke. The gunners, men who sat in glass bubbles and aluminum cages fighting off fighters with nothing but machine guns and courage. They took off in darkness, forming up over England, 300 bombers and 200 fighters, the largest raid yet on Bremen. From the ground, they must have looked like a plague of locusts heading east. From inside, it was organized chaos. Radio chatter, engine noise, the constant scan for enemy fighters. Charlie flew tight formation, wingtip to wingtip, because stragglers died first. The channel passed beneath them, gray and cold as a corpse. Then Belgium, then the German border. This was where it always started, the first black puffs of flak appearing like periods at the end of unfinished sentences. The fighters would come later. They always did. Watching, waiting, choosing the weak and wounded. At 25,000 feet, the temperature was 40 below. Ice formed on everything. Breath froze in oxygen masks. Gun barrels had to be fired every few minutes to keep them from freezing shut. This was the war nobody saw in newsreels. The war of numb fingers and frozen feet. Of oxygen deprivation and constant grinding fear. Up here, death came in many costumes. Enemy fighters, flak, mechanical failure, ice, collision. Or simply the human body giving up in conditions it was never meant to endure. But they flew on, because the factories below made the weapons that killed their friends. Because every bomb that found its target meant the war might end one day sooner. Because they were 20 years old and believed they were immortal right up until the moment they learned they weren't. Bremen appeared through the clouds like a cancer on the earth. Hell is not a place. It's a moment. For Charlie Brown, hell began at exactly 11:47 a.m. over Bremen. The flak was a living thing, a creature of steel and fire that reached up with 1,000 hands. The German 88mm guns were the best in the world, and Bremen had hundreds of them. They filled the sky with metal, turning the air itself into the enemy. You couldn't dodge flak. You could only fly through it and pray your number wasn't up. Bandits! Bandits! 12 o'clock high! The tail gunner's voice cracked over the intercom. Here came the fighters, FW-190s and Me-109s diving from the sun where gunners couldn't see. They hit the formation like wolves on sheep. The sky erupted in tracers and explosions. Planes began to fall. Charlie held formation. In the bomber stream, you were part of a defensive network, all those guns covering each other. Break formation and you're dead. But holding formation meant flying straight and level while fighters tried to kill you. It meant watching the plane next to you explode and doing nothing but fly through the debris. It meant being a target that couldn't run. The first pass took out their number 3 engine. The prop windmilled uselessly, creating drag. Now they were slower. Now they were starting to fall behind. In aerial combat, speed is life. Lose speed, lose life. Simple as that. The second pass was worse. Cannon shells punched through the fuselage like it was paper. Charlie heard screams on the intercom. The waist gunner was hit. The radio operator was dead. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit, red as blood and twice as slippery. The plane shuddered and bucked like a dying animal. Pilot to crew, check in. Charlie's voice was steady. You had to be steady. If the pilot panicked, everyone died. Silence from the tail, silence from the waist. The ball turret gunner was trapped, his mechanism jammed. The navigator was trying to stop the bombardier's bleeding with one hand while still calling out headings with the other. This was no longer a warplane, it was a flying emergency room. A flying morgue. They made it to the target, somehow. Frenchie, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, still crawled into the bombardier's position, still lined up the crosshairs, still picked his aiming point with the care of a surgeon. The bombs fell away, and for a moment the plane lifted, freed from 4,000 pounds of death. Below, the aircraft factory disappeared in smoke and flame. Mission accomplished. Now all they had to do was fly 500 miles home through enemy territory in a dying airplane. The fighters came back. Of course they did. They could smell blood like sharks. One by one, Ye Olde Pub's guns fell silent. No ammunition. Dead gunners. Frozen mechanisms. Charlie flew on, using every trick he knew. Sliding into cloud banks, diving to treetop level, anything to break the attacks. But you can't hide when you're trailing smoke. You can't run when 2 engines are dead and a third is dying. Then he saw him. A lone 109 coming in from 6 o'clock. The position where they had no guns left. This was it. This was how it ended. Charlie gripped the yoke and waited for the shells that would tear them apart. They never came. The German pilot flew closer, close enough that Charlie could see his face. It was a moment that shouldn't exist in war. 2 enemies, close enough to see each other's eyes. The German was older, maybe 30. A veteran by the way he flew. He had them dead to rights. Ye Olde Pub couldn't defend herself. Couldn't run, could barely fly. One burst from those wing cannons and it would all be over, but the German didn't fire. He flew alongside studying the broken bomber. Charlie could see him taking in the damage. The shattered tail, the ventilated fuselage, the dead engines, the blood painted on the windows. This wasn't a bomber anymore. It was a flying coffin that refused to accept its fate. The German pilot made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He pulled ahead of the bomber and waggled his wings. "Follow me." Charlie didn't understand. Was this some trick? Lead them deeper into Germany to be finished off? But what choice did he have? They were lost. Compass shot to pieces. Navigator unconscious. Following might mean death. Not following meant certain death. For 20 minutes, the German led them west. Through gaps in the flak barrage, around known fighter bases, he was escorting them. This enemy, this killer who wore the wrong uniform and served the wrong cause, was saving their lives. When they reached the coast, he pulled up alongside one more time. Charlie could see him clearly. Brown hair, blue eyes, a human face on what was supposed to be a monster. The German pilot saluted. Then he was gone, peeling away back toward Germany, back toward a war that made no sense when you looked another man in the eyes and saw yourself. Charlie flew on over the North Sea. The plane was dying faster now, losing altitude, losing hope. England was out there somewhere, but where? How far? Did they have enough altitude to make it? The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. Every minute meant more miles, but less height. The sea below was December cold. Hit that water and you had minutes before hypothermia took you. Land. I see land. Andy's voice weak but clear. The white cliffs of Dover. The most beautiful sight in the world, but they were too low. The engines were failing. Charlie had kept them airborne through will alone. But will has limits. Physics doesn't care about courage. That's when he saw the town. Right in their glide path, right where Ye Olde Pub wanted to die. A typical English village, church spires. Neat rows of houses, school buildings, people living their lives, not knowing death was falling toward them at 150 miles per hour. Charlie had seconds to decide, bail out and let the plane become a bomb, or ride it down and try to miss the innocents below. He'd made this choice before over Bremen. He made it again now. Pushed the nose down to gain speed. Used that speed to bank away from the town. Every foot of turn cost precious altitude he didn't have, but every foot meant lives saved. The ground rushed up, a field, muddy and brown and beautiful. He had just enough speed, just enough control, just enough luck. The crash was violent poetry, metal shrieking, earth and sky changing places. The sound of 10 tons of aluminum trying to stop instantly, then silence. Beautiful, impossible silence. Charlie Brown had brought his crew home. What was left of them? Survival is its own kind of death. You leave pieces of yourself scattered across the sky. Charlie woke up in the hospital 3 days later. They told him he'd saved 5 of his crew. 4 were gone. They told him he was a hero. He felt like a failure. Heroes bring everyone home. Heroes don't have to write letters to mothers explaining why their sons won't be coming back. Heroes don't wake up at night, hearing the voices of dead men asking why them and not you. The physical injuries healed, broken ribs, shrapnel wounds, frostbite that took 2 toes. The invisible injuries were different. Charlie couldn't close his eyes without seeing Bremen, couldn't hear an engine without flinching, couldn't look at the sky without searching for fighters. They called it combat fatigue, said it would pass. They lied. It doesn't pass. You just learn to carry it. They wanted to send him home, mission complete. 25 missions survived, more than most. But Charlie couldn't go. Not while his friends were still flying. Not while the war still needed pilots, not while he could still make a difference. So he signed up for another tour. And another. Flying became his penance. Every mission a chance to balance the ledger, to save one more crew, to prevent one more telegram. He flew 50 more missions, saw Berlin burn, watched the Luftwaffe die, helped pound Germany into submission. But he never forgot December 20th, 1943. Never forgot the German pilot who chose humanity over duty. Never forgot the moment over the English town when he chose to risk his life rather than risk innocent ones below. After the war, Charlie went home to West Virginia, married his sweetheart, had kids, built a life. But part of him never left the sky over Europe. Part of him was still 23 years old, making impossible choices in impossible moments. He didn't talk about the war. What was there to say? How do you explain the arithmetic of death? How do you describe the weight of other men's lives in your hands? Years became decades. The nightmares faded but never disappeared. Charlie became a businessman, a father, a grandfather. The war became history, something in books and movies that never quite got it right. They always made it about glory, about good versus evil. They never captured the confusion, the terror, the way your hands shook so bad you couldn't light a cigarette, the way you aged 5 years in 5 minutes. But one day, 40 years after the war, Charlie got a letter from Germany, from a man named Franz Stigler, the German pilot who had spared them, who had escorted them to safety, who had chosen mercy over duty. Franz had been searching for years, trying to find the American pilot he couldn't kill, trying to understand his own choice, trying to find peace with his war. They began writing. 2 old enemies becoming friends, sharing their stories, their guilts, their ghosts. Learning that the man on the other side of the guns had been just as young, just as scared, just as human. Franz had been an ace, with dozens of kills, but he couldn't shoot down ye olde pub. In his letters he explained, "I saw you were terribly wounded. I saw your gunners were dead. To shoot you down would have been like shooting a man in a parachute. I couldn't do it. You were no longer enemies. You were fellow airmen in distress." The letters became phone calls. The phone calls became a meeting. 2 old men standing face to face in a hotel lobby, seeing each other clearly for the first time. They met in a Seattle hotel, January 1990, almost 50 years after their encounter in the sky. Charlie recognized Franz immediately. Those same blue eyes. Older now, wrapped in wrinkles, but still holding that humanity that had saved Charlie's life. They stood there. 2 old warriors not sure whether to shake hands or embrace. They did both. And then they cried. Decades of suppressed emotion breaking free like water through a dam. They talked for hours, days, comparing memories, filling in gaps. Franz told his side of the story. He'd been flying his 487th combat mission that day. 487 times he'd taken off to kill. He'd seen too much, done too much, lost too many friends. When he saw ye olde pub, he saw not an enemy, but airmen like himself, boys trying to get home, boys who'd already paid too high a price. "I thought of my brother," Franz said, "shot down over Africa. I thought, what if some enemy pilot had shown him mercy? What if someone had helped him home? I couldn't kill you. It would have haunted me forever, but it haunted him anyway. Different ghosts." After the war, Franz was ostracized in Germany for his wartime service, called a Nazi, spat on, threatened. He emigrated to Canada, started over, buried his past. But you can't bury what lives in your head. He'd saved 1 American crew, but how many had he killed? The arithmetic of war has no solution, no way to balance the books. Charlie shared his own ghosts, the men he'd lost, the cities he'd bombed, the families under those bombs who were just as innocent as the English town he'd saved. They were mirror images, these 2 men. Same trauma, different uniforms. Same questions that had no answers. Why did some live while others died? How do you reconcile duty with humanity? How do you live with what war makes you do? They became best friends, traveled together to air shows and veterans gatherings, told their story to anyone who would listen. Not as propaganda for peace, though peace was the message, but as witness. This is what war does. This is what it costs. This is how thin the line between enemy and friend. School children would ask them, "Were you heroes?" And they would look at each other and say, "No, we were just men trying to survive, trying to hold on to our humanity. The real heroes didn't come home." Franz died first, 2008. Charlie spoke at his funeral, called him his brother, said that December 20th, 1943, had defined both their lives. One moment of mercy in an ocean of cruelty. One proof that even in war's machinery, the human heart could still beat. Charlie followed 6 months later. They said he died of a stroke, but his family knew better. He died of a broken heart, his brother was gone, and Charlie was tired of carrying the weight alone. But their story lived on, in books, in documentaries, in the hearts of everyone who heard it, because it held a truth we desperately need to believe, that even in our darkest moments, we can choose light, that enemies are just strangers wearing different uniforms, that mercy is not weakness but the ultimate strength. 2 men, 2 planes, 1 moment. It shouldn't have mattered in a war that killed 60 million, but it did. Because it reminded us that inside every warrior is a human being. Inside every enemy is a potential friend. Inside every moment of violence is a choice for peace. The children never understood why Grandpa Charlie kept a model of a German fighter plane on his mantle, right next to his medals, next to the photo of his B-17 crew. This enemy aircraft, lovingly detailed, carefully maintained. Visitors would see it and assume it was a trophy, a symbol of victory. They were wrong. It was a reminder of the day humanity won a small battle in a larger war. Charlie's grandson, Michael, was 10 when he finally asked about it. They were alone, sorting through old photographs, black and white memories of young men who looked impossibly young. "Grandpa, why do you have a Nazi plane in your living room?" Charlie was quiet for a long time. How do you explain war to a child who's known only peace? How do you describe the paradox of killing and being killed by people you don't hate? He pulled out a photograph. 2 old men at an air show, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling like brothers. "That's Franz," he said. "He saved my life." The story came out slowly, carefully, edited for young ears, but honest in its essence. Michael listened with the intensity children reserve for important truths. When Charlie finished, the boy was crying, but he was the enemy. "No," Charlie said, "he was a man. We were all just men. The war was the enemy." This became Charlie's mission in his final years, speaking at schools, veterans gatherings, anywhere people would listen. He and Franz together when possible, alone when necessary. They weren't preaching pacifism. They knew sometimes war is unavoidable. But they were preaching humanity, the idea that even in war, we have choices. Even in violence, we can choose mercy. Even in hatred, we can find love. The responses were mixed. Some veterans understood immediately. They had their own Franz Stieglers, moments when the enemy became human, when mercy interrupted murder. Others were angry. How dare he humanize the enemy? How dare he forgive? Their friends had died. Their innocence had been shattered. Forgiveness felt like betrayal. Charlie understood their anger. He'd felt it himself. But hate is a poison you drink hoping others will die. It corrodes your soul, leaves you hollow. Franz had taught him that their shared trauma was stronger than their different uniforms, their common humanity more important than their opposed nations. Healing came not from forgetting, but from forgiving. Not just Franz, not just Germany, but himself. The hardest audience was always other bomber crews, men who'd dropped their bombs and flown home trying not to think about what they'd left behind. Charlie would tell them about flying over that English town, about choosing to crash rather than let his plane kill innocents. And he'd see recognition in their eyes. They all had these moments, choices made in split seconds that defined the rest of their lives. The bomb loads they'd dropped, the ones they'd brought home, the targets they'd hit, the ones they'd missed on purpose. War makes philosophers of farm boys, But peace makes storytellers of warriors. Charlie Brown spent 40 years in silence, then 20 years bearing witness. The arithmetic was simple. He owed it to the dead to speak for them, to tell their stories, to ensure their sacrifice meant something. Every speech was a memorial, every handshake a connection, every tear a payment on an unpayable debt. Never forget, he would always end. But more important, never stop choosing humanity. The last time Charlie flew was in a restored B-17. He was 85 years old. They'd invited him to an air show, a special flight for surviving bomber crews. Charlie almost didn't go. His hands shook now, not from fear but from age. His eyes weren't sharp enough to spot fighters at 12 o'clock high. But something pulled him back to the sky. One more time. One last dance with the clouds. The bomber was beautiful, restored with love by people who'd never seen war but understood its echoes. Polished aluminum skin, engines that purred instead of coughed. Gun positions filled with tourists instead of scared boys. It even smelled wrong. No cordite, no hydraulic fluid, no fear sweat. Just aviation fuel and fresh paint. Charlie climbed into the cockpit. Muscle memory is a strange thing. His hands found switches that hadn't existed for 60 years. His feet found rudder pedals like greeting old friends. For a moment, he was 23 again. For a moment, Andy was beside him making jokes. Frenchie was calling out headings. The gunners were checking in, all present, all accounted for, all ghosts. They took off smooth as silk, no overload. No struggle to climb. No formation to hold, just an old bomber carrying old men into a peaceful sky. Charlie took the controls when they leveled off. The yoke felt exactly as he remembered. Heavy, solid, alive. He made gentle turns, feeling the plane respond. Still a ship. Still his ship. Below, the crowd watched and applauded. They saw a veteran taking a victory lap. They didn't see the tears on his face, didn't know he was flying for all the men who couldn't, for the ones still in Germany, still in the Channel, still scattered across Europe like seeds that would never grow. He was flying for Franz, gone now, but somehow present. Flying for every moment of mercy in the midst of madness. The landing was perfect, of course it was. No battle damage, no dead engines, no decisions about who lives and who dies. Just an old plane kissing the runway like a lover's touch. Charlie shut down the engines and sat in the sudden silence. The crowd was cheering, but he wasn't there. He was over Bremen, over the English town, over all the places where boys became men and men became memories. They helped him down from the plane. Photographers wanted pictures. Reporters wanted quotes. Young men in uniform wanted to shake his hand, thank him for his service. Charlie obliged them all, smiled, waved, said the right words, but inside, he was saying goodbye. To the sky, to the plane, to the boy he'd been, and the man he'd become. That night in his hotel room, Charlie wrote one last letter, to Franz's family, to his own family, to anyone who would listen. He wrote about choices, about mercy, about the terrible arithmetic of war and the beautiful mathematics of peace. He wrote about December 20th, 1943, when two enemies became brothers, when humanity won a small victory in a large defeat. He ended with a simple truth. We are all flying damaged planes trying to make it home. Sometimes we need an escort, sometimes we need to be one. The uniform doesn't matter. The flag doesn't matter. Only the choice matters. Choose mercy. Choose humanity. Choose to see the person, not the enemy. Because in the end, we're all just trying to land safely. Charlie Brown died in his sleep 6 months later. They found him peaceful, a slight smile on his face. On his nightstand was a model plane, not a B-17, a Messerschmitt 109, Franz's plane. A reminder that enemies can become brothers, that war can teach peace, that even in our darkest skies we can choose to be each other's escorts home. Every December 20th, Michael visits his grandfather's grave. He brings his own children now, tells them the story. The headstone is simple: Charles L. Brown, 1920-2008. Pilot, husband, father, friend. But Michael knows what's missing: hero. Not for the missions flown or the bombs dropped. Not for the medals earned or the enemies destroyed. But for 2 moments when he chose humanity over survival, when he chose others' lives over his own. The story spreads like ripples on water, each telling reaching new ears, each listener carrying it forward. In classrooms where children learn that enemies are human. In therapies where veterans finally forgive themselves. In quiet moments where people choose mercy over vengeance. Charlie and Franz's moment keeps happening again and again whenever someone chooses to see the human behind the uniform. There's a museum now, dedicated to their story. School children come by the thousands. They see the photographs, touch the artifacts, watch the interviews. But the most powerful exhibit is the simplest. 2 model planes suspended in air, forever frozen in that moment of decision. 1 damaged bomber struggling home. 1 fighter choosing not to fire. The placard reads, December 20th, 1943. The day mercy flew on both sides. Veterans come too, old men with old pain. They stand before those planes and remember their own moments, the targets they didn't hit, the triggers they didn't pull, the enemies they helped, the humanity they preserved. Some leave letters, confessions, apologies to men long dead. Thanks to Charlie and Franz for showing that warriors can also be healers. The letters pile up. From Germany. From America. From Japan, Russia, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Every war producing its Charlie Browns and Franz Steiglers. Every conflict creating moments when mercy interrupts murder. The names change. The uniforms change. The weapons change. But the choice remains constant. Kill or spare. Hate or understand. Destroy or protect. Michael reads every letter, shares them with his children. Teaches them that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the presence of compassion. That strength isn't the ability to destroy, but the ability to refrain. That victory isn't counted in enemies killed, but in humanity preserved. These are Charlie's lessons, passed down like DNA, the inheritance of mercy. History books record the numbers. Missions flown, bombs dropped, planes destroyed. Cities burned. But they missed the truth Charlie and Franz knew. War isn't about nations or ideologies. It's about individuals making impossible choices in impossible moments. It's about boys becoming men in the space between trigger pulled and trigger released. It's about learning that your enemy bleeds the same color you do. We live in a world still torn by conflict, still divided by uniforms and flags and ideas, but Charlie Brown's choice echoes forward. Every time someone chooses understanding over anger, every time mercy defeats vengeance, every time we see the human behind the label. His B-17 is gone, scrapped for metal, but his decision lives on in that English town that doesn't know it was saved, in the German families Franz didn't orphan, in every moment when we choose to crash our own planes rather than let them crash into others. This is Charlie's legacy. Not the bombs he dropped, but the ones he didn't. Not the enemies he killed, but the one who became his brother. Not the war he fought, but the peace he found. He showed us that even in our darkest moments we can choose light. Even in our deepest hatred, we can find love. Even when falling from the sky, we can choose where we land. So remember Charlie Brown. Remember Franz Stiegler. Remember that December day when the world was burning and 2 men chose not to add to the flames. Remember that inside every enemy is a potential friend. Inside every moment of violence is an opportunity for grace. Inside every one of us is the power to choose. And when your moment comes, because it will come in war or peace, in conflict or calm, when you must choose between your life and others' lives, between your safety and others' humanity, between what's easy and what's right, remember an American pilot who chose to crash. Remember a German pilot who chose not to shoot. Remember that mercy is not weakness but strength. That compassion is not surrender, but victory. Remember and choose well. Like this video if Charlie and Franz's story moved you. Subscribe to hear more untold tales of humanity in the midst of war. Share your own stories in the comments, of mercy given or received, of enemies who became friends, of moments when compassion conquered conflict. Because history isn't just made by armies and nations. It's made by individuals choosing humanity in the face of inhumanity. This channel exists to tell their stories, to honor their choices, to remind us all that even in war, we can choose peace. Even in darkness,